Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Today's episode is the first of a three-part series on software architecture. For this series, I met with different engineers and architects from both academia as well as the private sector. And together we look at various aspects of software architecture, from research software engineering to solution architects and software architecture at enterprise level. Software architecture can sometimes be a nebulous term. And of course, there are some who wonder whether we need architects at all. Wikipedia, for instance, defines software architecture as referring to the fundamental structures of a software system and the discipline of creating such structures and systems. Well, that sounds lofty, but in reality there are quite different types of software architecture and roles for architects and organizations. In this first part, I wanted to get a broad sense of software architecture, and in particular how it fits in with research software engineering. And for this I met with James Smithies from King's College in London, Steve Crouch from Southampton University, and Keith Gutfreund from Elsevier, Boston in the US. As per usual, let's start with some introductions, first from Steve Crouch.
I'm Steve Crouch. I lead the software team at the Software Sustainability Institute. So a lot of what the software team does is helping researchers improve their software, either directly by reviewing their code bases or perhaps helping to improve the practices they use to develop that software. My job title actually is software architect. And on that note, a lot of help we give is around issues to do with architecture, improving the design of software. And also my software architect role extends to the research software group at Southampton, where I design software solutions or review them for projects. I'm also heavily involved in training.
Excellent. Thank you very much. James.
I'm Director of King's Digital Lab at King's College London and Deputy Director of eResearch as well. Our lab is an arts and humanities research software engineering team. I'm actually a historian by trade, but I've spent 5 years working in government and commercial IT in New Zealand and London as a technical writer, business analyst, and then project manager. And most of my exposure to architecture and enterprise architecture was as a technical writer working with systems analysis and architecture teams at the New Zealand Ministry of Health. And I really consider myself the non-technical person on the panel.
Hello, Keith. A quick introduction from you, please.
Sure, thanks, Peter. My name is Keith Gutfreund. I've been an engineer working in computer software for a long time, over 40 years now, but most of that time I've been at just two companies. For the last 4.5 years, I've been a member of a software architecture team where I'm a senior architect. And the team consists of all different kinds of architects. So we have solutions architects, infrastructure or technical architects, and enterprise architects. But when I'm working as an architect, I often do a lot of these different types of architecture work, sometimes as a solutions architect, sometimes as an enterprise architect.
Thank you very much. So the reason why we're here is actually to talk about architecture. And for this episode, architecture on a rather general term and how that might fit in with research software engineering. And the backdrop to this, if I may just quickly say this, is that over the recent years, we have seen the number of research software engineers grow, not only in the UK and the US, but worldwide, in fact. It's quite a fast-growing movement. But with increasing number of engineers, there probably comes more specializations for the engineers and the work they do. And hence the idea of, do we actually need research software architects, which is, I think, Steve, what you are actually in Southampton. Maybe we can start our discussion today what we actually mean by software architecture, because it can be kind of a nebulous term, but maybe we can specify a little bit more what this broad term actually means.
Perhaps I could go first as the non-technical person here and someone who's been exposed to architecture through working with architects rather than being one. But generally, I view an architect as being someone who's responsible for the high-level design of software products, including control of the design patterns, so code, data models, components, and often also integration into client, enterprise, or national systems infrastructure. The architects that I've worked with could do everything from cutting code to defining technology roadmaps, and were quite business-facing with responsibility for ensuring products aligned to business goals as much as the technical and user context they were to be deployed into.
Keith, since you are actually working as an architect, how did you become an architect in Elsevier, or the company you're currently working at?
It was a long path, I think, to becoming an architect at Elsevier. I started off as being a individual technical contributor, and I think the path to becoming an architect, I think starts with really having a good understanding of technology, and then having worked in technology for a while, then having a broad exposure to different aspects of technology so that you're comfortable in thinking about technology and speaking about technology. And then it naturally came to me in my role as an engineer that I started to broaden the scope of my contacts and my interactions with colleagues working in other departments. And so, and then perhaps contributing to best practices and sharing them. I think that experience of having some influence and participating in discussions and extending the breadth perhaps of my perspective led me to become more involved in architecture type work.
If I may stay with you, Keith, for a while, you alluded already to the different kinds of roles of architects, because it is actually quite a broad term. So like solutions architect and enterprise architect, we're actually having 2 more episodes specifically on these 2 areas. But could you give us a high-level overview what they actually are quickly, sort of the differences, so we understand?
I was thinking about this ahead of time, Peter. So I looked up, and I have this quote on my wall that from Grady Booch that architecture represents the significant design decisions that shape a system. For me, I think of architecture more as the form of a system. I'm trying to think of what does it feel like? What does it look like to me? Is that a starting point for an architect? There are 3 different types of roles that I work in architecture. One is as a solutions architect, where I'm working with a particular business or a particular project where there are business constraints. For instance, there might be political or legal constraints, and I have to mesh those with appropriate technical solutions that will solve those business constraints. And that's my role as a solutions architect to do that. Another kind of architect is a infrastructure architect or a technical architect. And those are architects that specialize in DevOps. At least that's how I see that at Elsevier. And then the last one is an enterprise architect, where when I'm working in that mode, then I'm taking a broad view of the organization, and I want to define and align our technology strategy with the organization's goals. Sometimes I'm doing all of those even in the same day. So,
Steve, finally from you. So you're obviously architect already. That's your job title. How did you get into that role? And actually, what does it mean for you in a research context?
Way back in about, crikey, I think before the 2000s, I was working on a number of research projects. So originally I had my PhD in computer science, did some research computer science, paper publications, that kind of thing, and that's fine. But I did find I took a lot of interest in the actual development side of that. And then in the early 2000s, I began working on a UK e-science project. One of our many goals, was to develop and package infrastructure software for researchers, like many other e-science projects at the time, I suppose. But we did it by taking on board industry standard development practices. So we even had an IBM project manager overseeing the development process, for example. Coming from an academic background, this really was a huge eye-opener. It completely changed the way I saw software development. It taught our entire development team a tremendous amount, really, not just about the technologies and the design of software, critically important, but about the process as well. And that really did put me on the path, really, I think, to becoming a software architect.
Bearing in mind the various different views that we just now heard, do you think, and that's a question really for James and Steve mainly, do you think that the software architecture could help in research software engineering, as it does, for instance, as Keith described, in businesses? And how do you think, what kind of software architects could we identify in research software engineering?
My sense is that we're at quite a key transition point in research software engineering, where things are evolving towards larger scale, more complex work that requires a much greater degree of technical integration. And that's obviously the case with data science methods that rely on large data sets, especially when there's a need for tight access control, if they're using personally identifiable or otherwise sensitive information. but it also applies more generally in the need to increase the quality and maintainability of the software we produce and ensure the research it enables is transparent and reproducible. I want to emphasize too that I don't want to offer a counsel of perfection, because research software engineering, and Steve, I'd be interested to hear Steve's thoughts on this, but research software engineering has unique requirements related to enabling rapid development and creativity. But that just means that sort of any form of architectural practice that's developed for RSE should have those requirements baked in. Like, we need to thread the needle between not reinventing the wheel and introducing these architectural practices, but not restricting research activity either. And interestingly, though, I think my experience of working with architects has been that that's key architectural philosophy, whether it's commercial or government sector anyway. But I think it's something we specifically need to focus on in the research sector. And lastly, I'd suggest that architecture should help us communicate and collaborate with our colleagues in university IT departments. So not by dampening RSE creativity, as it were, with industry models, but developing a common language that can clearly define research software engineering requirements and goals at that higher enterprise level and systems integration level.
Steve?
Yes, I have to agree with James on this. I think that software architecture really does have a lot to offer, and I think it does have to be tempered to some degree to the needs of research, absolutely. The technical landscape itself has changed drastically over the last 10 to 15 years. So many more software technologies, more frameworks, more infrastructure. You can take cloud as an example, a huge potential to transform the academic research landscape if used properly. And more compute means, you can do things like running far more simulations in less time, more time for research. And of course, all these technical opportunities raise many challenges for research software development. And I think that's only one facet of it, really. And yes, introducing good practice, I think, is always a balance when it comes to research. So research goals in academic projects, research goals come first, but there's also other factors on the horizon, and they've been emerging in recent years to do with reproducibility and reusability of software that are becoming more important, which I think need to be addressed. And I think architecture and the aspects related to it, such as software design, I think have a very, very important role to play. I think with the more complex technical landscape and research software dealing with far more challenges than it ever really used to across the board, software architecture has this role. It's really inevitable, I think, that aspects of architecture and good software design will enter research software in the large.
So there will be some people who might argue that a lot of what we do as research software engineers is really small, confined projects. Do we really need an architect for that?
It might be worth me speaking to that from an arts and humanities perspective, or a digital humanities perspective, because we're naturally smaller scale. And the fact is that even in our domain, we're experiencing this transition from sort of away from servers under the desk type model to data science, working with virtual reality, augmented reality, a lot more complex systems. We don't want researchers and research software engineers to be stuffing around with wires and boxes anymore. That was useful at a certain stage in development to make sure that we sort of understood things at a really core technical level. But now we need platforms and infrastructure that RSEs and researchers can turn up to with their tools. Architecture is needed even for those to enable those smaller projects. And I guess that's a segue into that other issue of large scale infrastructures, where now in the UK we're talking a lot about national infrastructure strategies, and we look across to Europe that have been doing great work for years and have a really long-term view of infrastructure, which is necessary as well.
I could also add something to that point too. So I totally agree. I think the thing from my side is that there is the role of software architect, but there's also the skill set of architecture and software design, where it may not be possible or even make sense to have someone with, working 100% as a software architect. There's still the skill set. So where you have projects or research software groups working at a small scale, it may make more sense to upskill the researchers, the research developers, the RSEs in terms of architectural skills, as opposed to having a dedicated role. So that could well be a first valid step, perhaps, in doing that. And then as the team grows, then I guess specialization comes into it, and then perhaps software architecture becomes a role in addition to being just a skill set. So it could be a percentage of someone's time within a group as someone who is working as a software architect, and maybe that percentage rises over time to become, perhaps 100% of a person, or perhaps that's split a number of ways across a number of people who could be architects.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Keith, because what I'm hearing from the discussion is that there are a number of aspects to why we need architects, like, for instance, best practices and guidelines, and making sure that we're working towards a common goal and working in a similar framework or in an understood framework.
Mm-hmm.
The governance aspect of it. Keith, I want to know from you in the private sector, how important is the governance aspect and best practices to you in your work?
So it's pretty important, and it's probably the majority of the work that we do as architects. In industry, the way that I see architects working mostly is doing very little of coding and development work, and spending much more time in governance and in establishing standards for practice throughout the organization. So what programming languages, are we approving for this type of work? Things like that. But even more than that is establishing best practices. So we would find those in industry, we would source those through other engineering groups in our domain, and share those in a collaborative way to build up those best practices. So we spend a lot of time, I think, in doing that governance aspect, and much less as perhaps a team member coding or contributing to a design.
There is also another aspect that I would like to move on to, which is career paths. RSEs are a fairly new role. Well, not quite that new anymore. I think they've been around for a few years in the UK at least, and also in the US and some other countries. But they're growing, as I mentioned earlier in the intro, all over the globe right now. But how can people progress in their careers? In the private sector, there is the possibility, which is what Keith has been talking about or alluding to, the possibility of grow into a technical senior role via the architecture role. Do you think that might be an opportunity as a career path in future for RSEs as well, Steve and James?
As we may well talk about anyway, there's a number of things I think that probably need to happen to enable that. I think, to be honest, I think it simply is inevitable. As RSEs as a role become more proliferate, I think, as we recognize that more and more researchers are working with software in this way, we're only finding that the RSE community is growing over time. The specialization into these kinds of roles that go beyond just RSE, such as project manager, software project manager, software architecture, and other similar types of roles, is just an inevitability, I think. So specialization in this way, I think, is just inevitable. And as many organizations like the RSE Society, the Software Sustainability Institute have been doing, promoting the role, lobbying for the role to gain recognition, seeing the advent of all the RSE groups in the UK emerge. I think at last count, there were like 30 institutions with their own RSE groups. And so there's this huge groundswell of RSEs. And I think it's just one of those things that just needs to happen and will happen eventually. But I think it's going to take a few steps to get there.
It's worth noting that RSE roles tend to be sort of hybrid in many ways and very locally specific. So if we can start developing an idea of the component parts to an RSE architecture role, they can be spread across a wide variety of RSE careers. In our lab, we have analysts and UI UX designers as well as engineers. And our principal research software engineer ostensibly holds most of those architectural responsibilities, but they are spread throughout the team as well. It's just, as a community, we don't really understand what RSE architecture might be or looks like. So it's difficult to sort of build them into cohesive roles.
You've mentioned that it requires several steps to get there. What kind of steps do you think we need to take? What would be next to get the ball rolling and get something like a specialization for software architecture going?
From my side, I think one of those things is really just to, you could do the usual stuff like promote awareness of the importance of software architecture across the field. That's one of those things that I think would be a prerequisite, really. So, you gain support at the grassroots level, gain recognition for the need for the role. I think from that, you can then sort of use that as a foundation to do other things. You need to understand, I think, absolutely right, what James has said, the types of architects, roles and skills that are needed across the community. Last year, for example, the Institute did a survey of the demands for skills within the research software engineering community. There was a huge variation in which skills are in demand across that community. This included the need for skills like software design and other high-level skills like project management. So we could do something similar. Perhaps we could commission a survey more focused around architecture and software design across the RSE software groups, perhaps as a starting point, just to see what the needs are there for skills. And then that kind of sort of builds a groundswell of evidence, or at least need for those types of skills. Then that takes the shape of roles. And as James said, that could be, in practice, something that is percentage of people's time. It could be that those roles are sort of spread across a team and not just one person. And I think that's probably what will happen anyway, and I think is already happening to some extent in any case, I would believe.
I'd encourage us to start exploring or offering papers and panels at the RSE conferences, sort of brainstorm what the role might look like and not jump in with assumptions. I mean, there's a very sort of humanist position, but I think we need to sort of interrogate what RSE architecture might look like in comparison to the commercial world. And there's a window of opportunity when we're just starting these conversations to sort of engage in conversations to work out where the similarities with the private sector are and where the differences might lie. So workshops talking through the idea will be quite interesting as well. But primarily, I think the goal of that kind of activity should be to get the community but also management and funders thinking about the potential for RSE architecture and the expectation that it'll either work and we'll start to see roles being advertised or disappear into the ether. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe we need to start with it with a blank canvas and not really have any assumptions about what it might evolve into.
I mean, you mentioned a word that I wanted to move on next, actually, which is funding. Because when we talk about roles and career paths, then certainly somebody needs to pay for it. Getting the community on board and convincing them that architecture is not only good, but it's actually needed and required to move forward as RSEs, it would be almost a natural progression. And I like the idea of having some community events, of which we actually had quite a few recently, through Saucy, for instance. At the same time, don't you think that we also need to have some kind of support from the funders? And how do you think we go about that?
As Steve said, the Society for Research Software Engineering and the Software Sustainability Institute are key, aren't they? Developing that conversation, but with a view to providing policy advice to UKRI around the infrastructure roadmap. We should have conversations, but with a view to aligning to national strategic direction, and also being clear that the purpose of developing an architectural sort of function within the RSE community, is to ensure ROI really for the funding pound, and research quality, and also enabling career development, which is a key focus of UKRI at the moment. So if we align at that level, it'll be easier to argue for funding at institutional as well as national levels. But I think it's also worth remembering the global context. There are communities outside the UK who may well be further along than us, or have models that we could point policymakers to demonstrate the value of architecture.
Yes, I agree. I think also, one of the things that occurred to me was we had some of these institutional research groups have been around for quite a long time. And some of them are growing quite large. It'd be interesting to see, I think, how they have supported RSEs that have been there for a while, and how they've supported the role evolving over time. So, these groups provide a means for a lot of projects and institutions to easily locate and access software expertise, for paying for RSE time, whether that's directly from within proposals or not. They have this opportunity to specialise their RSE staff. It'd be interesting to see how they've done that, what kind of roadblocks they've run up against institutionally, and perhaps with proposals and with the funding agencies trying to get those roles approved in grant proposals, and seeing where the best practice is at the moment for that.
So right now we've been talking about architects being embedded in the universities or in the area where they're working. But as Keith mentioned earlier, we also have enterprise architects where the architect actually works across different teams. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think it was James who mentioned national infrastructure projects that are coming along. Do you think there is something equivalent? Might sound a little bit far-fetched right now because we don't have research software architects apart from Steve or very few isolated cases yet. but in future that we could have something equivalent to an enterprise architect that actually overlooks strategies across different universities. And would that actually make sense even?
It reminded me of one key point that I wanted to get across as the non-technical person here, is that architecture as an endeavour needs to be owned and led by engineers first and foremost. And so does enterprise architecture, especially there's a risk with enterprise architecture that it sort of floats off into non-technical ownership, which needs to be avoided. But I don't think it's far-fetched at all, the idea of enterprise architecture for RSE. And in fact, perhaps I think it's one of the key outcomes of this kind of conversation for the long-term future of the RSE community. I'm not sure if it happens now, to be honest, but the UK needs a national enterprise architecture function that can align national research strategy with existing e-infrastructure capacity and future requirements and translate it into policy and funding that enables the grassroots RSE community. It seems strange to be considering investing millions in infrastructure without an EA function to oversee it. But again, it needs to be a mode of EA tailored to research software engineering.
Steve?
To a large extent, the communications to try and establish such a network of these sort of architects is already really in place. So you've got institutions that we talked about, organisations like the RSE Society. There's also the RSE Leaders Network as well, who represent their research software groups. And you could make use of these groups to attract interest in building a sort of a network of architects, I think. We should be working out how it should operate. And I think as a network of architects in its own right, I think this could do a lot of good at the community level as well, in addition to what James said. So, things like helping to identify, share and promote the best architectural practices that exist, collaborating on developing training curricula and materials for upskilling RSEs in architecture-related skills, which I think is really, honestly, a good logical next step. And it's one of those things that is we're finding there's a lot of demand for skills beyond basic computational RSE skills. So they come along to a lot of the training events that we do and they say, this is great, what's the next step? At the Institute, for example, we're developing materials for an intermediate software carpentry course. And these skills at the intermediate level will go beyond that, working in teams, applying these skills within a team, working with architecture and using skills at the architectural and software design levels to stretch their legs and get them writing and designing software themselves. And then, of course, there's lots of opportunities if you have this network too, right? So you'd be able to draw across this architectural expertise from across the group to solve particularly challenging software design problems within the community. Yes, you do also have that as a support base for lobbying.
Keith, finally, before we close, what kind of advice would you give for somebody who wants to become an architect from a private industry perspective?
I had some thoughts on that, but I wanted also to follow up with what Steve and James were saying earlier about the requirement to have a certain amount of technical skill. And I'm wondering if I could just intermediately pose a question. I think that there are also some soft skills that really distinguish what an architect does from what an individual contributor or what a technologist does. Do you see that? Steve and James coming from a non-traditional background, are those soft skills more important for architecture roles?
My experience of architecture is really well aligned to my experience of the humanities and social science. Architects, in my experience, they have to work at quite a high level of abstraction and deal with imponderables like policy and design patterns. I would certainly say it has to be owned by engineers, but one of the benefits of architecture is that it brings a degree of perhaps fuzzy thinking to research software engineering that I think is really valuable and really well aligned to research software engineering.
I like that, the fuzzy thinking. That's how I would have liked to state my answer, Peter, to your question. That I think that it requires a different approach to solving technical problems, a much more approach where I'm listening more, I'm collaborating more, I'm trying to use my skills to influence and collaborate, I think. That's how I've transcended from a technical role to becoming an architect.
If I could build on that point as well that you both have made, I think, yes, the soft skill aspect is critically important, I think, for an architect. I think, at least in my field, architects tend to be those that are taking a keen interest in understanding the wider context of where software will operate. And I think that goes beyond just understanding the technicalities of that. it really is about understanding people and process. And in our case, the scientific process and where people involved in that process fit and where the software will fit. And that takes a lot of talking. It takes a lot of understanding and building an idea of not just the functional requirements, but also the non-functional requirements too. And I think that does take some degree of skill socially to be able to do that, yeah.
Thank you very much for this exciting discussion. I hope that 2021, despite all the obstacles we're currently facing, but I hope that 2021 will prove to be the year when we put software architecture in research software engineering on the map. And I think you alluded to some community events that could actually kickstart that. I hope that's going to happen, and I hope that this discussion will actually help launch it. The second and next part of the mini-series on software architecture will be on enterprise architects and architecture. I hope you'll tune in then. And with that, goodbye.